My name is Cheryl Martin, and I am 29 years old, and the night my mother-in-law slapped me in front of my husband's entire company, I finally understood that some battles aren't worth fighting quietly anymore. It happened at the Meridian Hotel downtown during what should have been the proudest moment of David's career, but instead became the moment I stopped pretending his family's cruelty was something I had to endure for the sake of keeping peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had spent 3 hours getting ready that evening, because I knew how important this promotion party was to David, and I wanted him to feel proud walking in with me on his arm. I chose a navy blue dress that was professional but elegant, and I spent extra time on my makeup because David's boss, Mr. Henderson, would be there along with all the senior partners from Blackstone Associates. David had been working toward this promotion to senior account manager for 2 years, and tonight was supposed to be his celebration. When we walked into the hotel ballroom, I could see David's shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. The room was decorated with white linens and soft lighting, and there were probably 60 people milling around with champagne glasses, talking in the kind of hushed tones that meant everyone was trying to impress everyone else. David squeezed my hand and whispered that he couldn't have done any of this without me, and for a moment I felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Then I saw Margaret Whitfield across the room. Margaret is David's mother, and she has made it clear since the day David and I got engaged that she considers me a temporary inconvenience in her son's life. She comes from what she calls old money, which as far as I can tell means her grandfather owned a small textile business that went under in the 1980s, but she still acts like she's descended from royalty. She was standing near the bar wearing a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and holding court with 2 other women who were nodding along to whatever story she was telling. David didn't see her right away because he was scanning the room looking for Henderson, but I knew the moment she spotted us because her expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed disgust. She excused herself from her conversation and started walking toward us with the kind of purposeful stride that made my stomach clench, because I knew she was about to make this evening about her. She reached us just as David was shaking hands with a colleague from his department, and without even acknowledging that he was in the middle of a conversation, she inserted herself between us and said loudly enough for several people to hear that she was surprised to see me there. I felt my face flush because I knew exactly what she was implying, that somehow I didn't belong at my own husband's promotion party, but I kept my voice level when I replied that of course I was there to support Dave. Margaret smiled in that way she does when she's about to say something cutting, and told me that she hoped I understood how important tonight was for David's career and that she trusted I wouldn't do anything to embarrass him. The words hit me like a physical blow because they were designed to make me feel small and out of place. And for a moment they worked. I could feel the eyes of David's colleagues on us, and I knew they were picking up on the tension even if they couldn't hear exactly what was being said. David finally finished his conversation and turned to us with a smile that faltered slightly when he saw the look on my face. He greeted his mother with a kiss on the cheek and asked if we'd met his wife Cheryl, as if Margaret and I hadn't been locked in a Cold War for the past 3 years. Margaret laughed a little too loudly and said of course she knew Cheryl, though she made my name sound like something distasteful she was trying not to swallow. I watched David's face as he processed the undercurrent of hostility, and I could see him making the same calculation he always made when his mother was involved. He would try to smooth things over by changing the subject or making a joke or finding an excuse to move us to a different part of the room because confronting his mother directly was something he had never learned how to do. I had seen this pattern play out dozens of times over the years, and I was tired of being the one who had to absorb her cruelty in silence. But tonight felt different because this was David's moment, and I wasn't going to let her poison it with her pettiness. I smiled at Margaret and told her how lovely she looked and asked if she was enjoying the party. She looked momentarily surprised that I wasn't rising to her bait, but she recovered quickly and launched into a monologue about how proud she was of David and how she always knew he would succeed because he came from good stock. The phrase good stock made my skin crawl because I knew she was drawing a deliberate contrast between David's pedigree and my own background. My parents are both teachers who work in public schools, and we lived in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, and Margaret has never let me forget that I didn't grow up with the same privileges that David did. She has a way of making observations about my clothing or my mannerisms or my family that sound like compliments on the surface, but are actually designed to highlight how different I am from the kind of woman she thinks David should have married. David excused himself to go find Miss Henderson, leaving me alone with Margaret, which I suspected was exactly what she had been waiting for. She moved closer to me and lowered her voice to a tone that was almost conversational but carried an edge that made my pulse quicken. She told me that she hoped I realized how lucky I was to be married to someone like David and that she trusted I wouldn't take his success for granted. I asked her what she meant by that, and she smiled again with that same cold expression and said that some people might be tempted to think they deserved credit for their spouse's achievements when really they were just along for the ride. The implication was clear. She was suggesting that I was somehow riding David's coattails rather than supporting him as an equal partner in our marriage. I felt something inside me shift at that moment because I realized that no matter how politely I responded to her attacks, she was never going to respect me or acknowledge that I had any value in David's life. She had decided from the beginning that I was beneath her son, and nothing I did or said was going to change her mind. The question was whether I was going to keep letting her treat me like an interloper at my own husband's celebration. I looked her straight in the eye and told her that I was proud of David's accomplishments and that I had been there supporting him through every late night and every stressful deadline and every moment of doubt he'd had about whether he was good enough for this promotion. I said that marriage was a partnership and that David and I built our life together as a team. Margaret's expression hardened and she told me not to get ahead of myself, that David's success was the result of his upbringing and his education and his natural talents, not because of anything I had contributed. She said that the sooner I learned my place, the happier everyone would be, including David. The words hung in the air between us, and I could feel my heart pounding because I knew she had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She wasn't just being rude or dismissive anymore. She was actively trying to undermine my marriage and my sense of self-worth, and I realized that staying quiet was no longer an option. I was about to respond when David returned with Miss Henderson in tow, and I could see the excitement on his face as he prepared to introduce me to the man who had just promoted him. Mr. Henderson was probably in his 50s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of running a successful company. He shook my hand warmly and told me how much he'd heard about me from David and how pleased he was to finally meet me. Margaret immediately inserted herself into the conversation, telling Mr. Henderson how proud the family was of David and how they had always known he was destined for great things. She spoke as if I wasn't standing right there, as if the conversation was happening between the three of them and I was just an observer. Miss Henderson was polite, but I could see him glancing at me with a slightly puzzled expression, as if he was trying to figure out why David's mother was monopolizing the conversation. David seemed oblivious to the dynamic that was playing out, and he was beaming as he talked about his plans for his new role and his gratitude for the opportunity. I tried to focus on his happiness and push down the anger that was building in my chest. But Margaret wasn't finished with me yet. When Miss Henderson mentioned that the company was hosting a retreat for senior staff and their spouses in the fall, Margaret immediately spoke up to say that she hoped David would be able to attend and that she was sure the company would understand if family obligations prevented his wife from joining him. The comment was so obviously designed to suggest that I was somehow a burden or an impediment to David's career that even Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger, and I was about to say something when Margaret made a comment about how different things were when she was a young wife and how she always made sure to stay in the background during her husband's professional events. The implication was clear that I was being too forward or too present, and that a proper wife would know when to make herself invisible. That was the moment when something inside me snapped, because I realized that she wasn't just attacking me anymore. She was trying to diminish my role in David's life in front of the people who mattered most to his career. She was attempting to paint me as someone who didn't understand professional boundaries or social expectations. And I knew that if I didn't respond, she would continue to chip away at my reputation until David's colleagues saw me as an embarrassment. I turned to face her directly, and in a voice was calm but loud enough for the people around us to hear. I said that I was grateful for her concern but that David and I made decisions about our life together as partners and that I was confident in my ability to support his career without needing guidance from anyone else. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger and she stepped closer to me until we were standing less than 2 feet apart. She told me in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow more menacing than if she had been shouting that I was making a mistake by speaking to her that way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And that I clearly didn't understand the position I was putting David in. I could see David and Miss Henderson watching us now and I knew that whatever happened next was going to define not just my relationship with Margaret but potentially David's standing with his boss. I took a deep breath and told Margaret that the only mistake I was making was allowing her to treat me with disrespect for as long as I had and that I wasn't going to apologize for defending myself or my marriage. That was when she slapped me. The sound of her palm connecting with my cheek echoed through our corner of the room and for a moment everything went completely silent. I could feel the sting spreading across my face and the heat of embarrassment and shock flooding through my body. I was dimly aware that several conversations had stopped and that people were turning to look at us. But my immediate focus was on Margaret's face, which showed a mixture of satisfaction and surprise as if she hadn't quite meant to do it, but wasn't sorry that she had. David's face went white and he stepped between us immediately, but I could see the confusion and panic in his eyes as he tried to process what had just happened. Miss Henderson was staring at Margaret with an expression of complete shock, and I realized that whatever impression she had been trying to make about my character had just backfired spectacularly. I touched my cheek where she had hit me and felt the heat radiating from the spot where her hand had made contact. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation of being slapped in front of my husband's colleagues and boss. But as I looked around the room and saw the expressions of people who had witnessed what happened, I realized that Margaret had just revealed more about herself than she had about me. Mr. Henderson was the first person to speak and his voice was tight with controlled anger when he asked Margaret if she had just struck her daughter-in-law at a company event. Margaret seemed to realize for the first time that she had just committed an act of violence in front of David's boss. And she started to stammer something about how I had been disrespectful, but Mr. Henderson cut her off. He told David that he was sorry this had happened and that he hoped I was all right, and then he looked directly at Margaret and said that he had never seen anything like what had just occurred and that he was appalled by her behavior. The censure in his voice was unmistakable, and I could see Margaret's face go pale as she realized that her attempt to put me in my place had instead exposed her own lack of character to the one person whose opinion mattered most to David's career. David was apologizing profusely to both Mr. Henderson and to me, but I could see the mortification in his eyes as he realized that his mother had just humiliated him in front of his boss. Other people were starting to gather around us now, drawn by the commotion, and I knew that within minutes everyone at the party would know what had happened. I looked at Margaret, who was standing there with her mouth slightly open as if she couldn't believe the situation had escalated so quickly, and I realized that this was my moment to respond. I could either retreat and let her narrative about my character stand, or I could use this opportunity to show everyone exactly who she was and what kind of family dynamic David had been trying to protect me from. I straightened my shoulders and looked directly at Mr. Henderson when I spoke, making sure my voice was clear and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I told him that I was fine and that I appreciated his concern and that I hoped this incident wouldn't reflect poorly on David, who had been nothing but professional and respectful throughout his time at the company. Then I turned to Margaret and in a voice that carried across the room I said that I was sorry she felt the need to resort to physical violence when she disagreed with someone, but that I wouldn't be intimidated by her behavior anymore. I said that David deserved to have his achievements celebrated without his family creating drama, and that I hoped she would consider whether her actions were helping or hurting her son's reputation. The words hung in the air and I could see people nodding in agreement and looking at Margaret with expressions of disapproval and disgust. She had gone from being the elegant mother of the guest of honor to being the woman who had slapped her daughter-in-law at a professional event, and I could see her realizing that there was no way to recover from what she had just done. Mr. Henderson stepped forward and told Margaret that he thought it would be best if she left the party and that he hoped she would take some time to reflect on her behavior. His tone was polite but firm, and it was clear that this wasn't a suggestion, it was a direct. Margaret looked around the room as if searching for support, but everyone was staring at her with a mixture of shock and condemnation. David was caught between his loyalty to his mother and his horror at what she had done, and I could see him struggling to find words that would somehow make the situation better. But there was nothing he could say that would undo what had happened or change the fact that his mother had just revealed herself to be someone who would resort to violence when she didn't get her way. Margaret gathered her purse and walked toward the exit without another word, but I could see the fury radiating from her with every step. She had come to the party intending to humiliate me, and instead she had humiliated herself and damaged her son's reputation in the process. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to prove I didn't belong in David's world, she had shown everyone that she was the one who didn't understand how to behave in professional settings. After she left, Miss Henderson put his hand on David's shoulder and told him that he was sorry his mother had created such an unpleasant situation, but that it wouldn't affect his standing at the company. He said that David's work spoke for itself and that one family member's poor judgment didn't reflect on his character or his abilities. Then he turned to me and asked again if I was all right, and told me that he had been impressed by how I had handled myself in a difficult situation. He said that it took strength and grace to respond to violence with words, and that he could see why David spoke so highly of me. The validation meant more than I could express because it came from the person whose opinion mattered most to David's career. As word of what had happened spread through the party, I found myself approached by several of David's colleagues who wanted to make sure I was okay and to express their shock at Margaret's behavior. Some of them shared their own stories about difficult in-laws or family members who had caused problems at professional events, and I realized that what had happened to me wasn't unique, but that most people had the sense not to let family drama spill over into work settings. David was quiet for most of the rest of the evening, and I could see him processing what had happened and what it meant for his relationship with his mother. He had spent years trying to manage the tension between us by keeping us separate or smoothing over conflicts, but tonight had made it impossible for him to pretend that the problem was equally distributed between his mother and his wife. When we finally left the party and got in the car to drive home, David sat in the driver's seat for several minutes without starting the engine. Finally, he turned to me and said that he was sorry and that he should have protected me from his mother's behavior long before it escalated to violence. He said that he had been hoping she would eventually come around and accept me, but that he realized now that he had been naive. I told him that I didn't blame him for what his mother had done, but that I wasn't going to continue pretending that her treatment of me was acceptable just to keep the peace. I said that tonight had shown me that standing up for myself wasn't just about my own dignity. It was about protecting our marriage and his career from her destructive behavior. David nodded and said that he understood and that things were going to have to change. He said that his mother had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed and that he wouldn't allow her to treat me with disrespect anymore, even if it meant limiting her role in our life. As we drove home, I touched my cheek again and realized that the sting from the slap had faded, but the clarity it had brought me remained. Margaret had intended to humiliate me, and instead she had given me the opportunity to show everyone who I really was and who she really was. She had wanted to prove that I didn't belong in David's world, but instead she had proven that she was the one who didn't understand how to behave with dignity and respect. I thought about Miss Henderson's words about strength and grace, and I realized that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't to match it with more cruelty, but to reveal it for what it is. By contrast, Margaret had shown everyone at that party exactly what kind of person she was, and I had shown them exactly what kind of person I was, and the difference had been unmistakable. When we got home, David poured himself a drink and sat down at the kitchen table with his head in his hand. He looked up at me and said that he was proud of how I had handled myself, but that he was ashamed of his mother and sorry that it had taken something like this to open his eyes to how badly she had been treating me. I sat down beside him and took his hand and told him that we would figure out how to move forward together, but that I needed him to understand that I couldn't continue to be the only one trying to maintain peace with his family. I said that his mother had made it clear that she would never accept me and that it was time for him to decide whether he was going to protect our marriage or continue trying to appease someone who had no interest in treating me with basic human decency. David squeezed my hand and promised that things would be different and that he would never again put me in a position where I had to endure his mother's abuse alone. He said that tonight had shown him what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of husband he needed to be, and that he was committed to making sure our marriage came first. As I got ready for bed that night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw that there was still a faint red mark on my cheek where Margaret had slapped me. But instead of feeling ashamed or defeated, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time when it came to David's family. I felt free. Margaret had spent 3 years trying to make me feel like I didn't belong, like I was somehow less than or unworthy of her son's love. Tonight she had shown everyone exactly who she was, and in doing so she had freed me from the burden of trying to win her approval or prove my worth to someone who was never going to acknowledge it anyway. I realized that sometimes the most liberating thing that can happen is when someone shows their true character so clearly that you no longer have to wonder where you stand or whether you're the problem. Margaret had given me that gift even though it wasn't what she intended, and I was grateful for the clarity even if the method had been painful. The next morning, I woke up to find several text messages from David's colleagues, who had witnessed what happened at the parties. They were checking on me and expressing their support, and telling me that Margaret's behavior had been completely unacceptable. One message from David's closest work friend said that he had never seen anything like it, and that he had even more respect for me after seeing how I had handled myself. I also had a message from Mr. Henderson's assistant, asking if I would be interested in joining the company's spouse network, which was a group that organized social events and volunteer activities for the partners and families of senior staff. The invitation felt like a clear signal that despite Margaret's best efforts to paint me as someone who didn't belong in David's professional world, I had actually strengthened my standing by showing grace under pressure. David was already up and dressed when I came downstairs, and he told me that his mother had called him 3 times since 6 in the morning, demanding that he talk to me about my behavior at the party. She was apparently trying to frame what had happened as my fault, claiming that I had been disrespectful and that she had simply reacted to my provocation. David said that he had listened to her for about 30 seconds before telling her that there was no justification for physical violence and that she owed me an apology. He said that she had hung up on him when he refused to take her side, and that he expected she would probably try to rally other family members to her cause. I told David that I wasn't interested in getting into a family war, but that I also wasn't going to pretend that what happened was acceptable or that I bore any responsibility for his mother's decision to hit me. I said that if his family wanted to choose sides, they were welcome to do so, but that I wasn't going to compromise my dignity or my safety to maintain relationships with people who couldn't treat me with basic respect. Over the following days, it became clear that word of what had happened at the promotion party had spread beyond David's immediate work circle. Margaret's behavior had been so shocking and public that people were talking about it, and the consensus seemed to be that she had revealed something deeply disturbing about her character. David received several calls from family members who had heard different versions of what happened, and he found himself in the position of having to defend me and explain that his mother had been completely out of line. Some of his relatives tried to make excuses for Margaret or suggest that there must have been more to the story, but David was consistent in his account of what had happened and his refusal to accept any narrative that blamed me for her action. The most telling response came from David's uncle, who called to say that he had always known Margaret had a cruel streak, but that he had never seen her act on it so publicly. He told David that he wasn't surprised by what had happened, but that he was disappointed it had taken so long for someone to stand up to her behavior. That conversation was a revelation for David because it suggested that other family members had witnessed Margaret's cruelty over the years, but had chosen to stay silent rather than confront her about it. It made him wonder how many other people she had mistreated and how many situations he had missed or misunderstood because he hadn't wanted to see his mother clearly. 3 weeks after the party, David received a formal complaint from his mother demanding that the company take action against Henderson for his treatment of her at the event. She claimed that he had been rude and unprofessional in asking her to leave, and that his behavior had been inappropriate for someone in his position. The complaint was so delusional and self-serving that it actually worked in David's favor because it showed his employer that Margaret was someone who would try to manipulate professional situations for personal gain. Henderson shared the complaint with David as a courtesy and told him that the company's legal team had advised that no response was necessary because the complaint had no merit. The incident also seemed to clarify Mr. Henderson's understanding of David's character because he began including him in higher-level projects and strategic discussions that had previously been beyond his reach. It was as if seeing how David handled his mother's behavior and supported his wife had given Mr. Henderson confidence in his judgment and integrity. I began to understand that Margaret's slap had backfired in ways she could never have anticipated. Instead of proving that I was somehow unworthy of David or unsuited to his professional world, she had shown everyone exactly what kind of person she was, and by contrast, had highlighted my own strength and dignity. The irony was that in trying to damage my reputation, she had actually enhanced it, and in trying to protect her son's career, she had created a situation that ultimately benefited him by demonstrating his character and judgment to his employer. As the months passed, Margaret made several attempts to reconcile with David, but she never once acknowledged that what she had done was wrong or offered any kind of apology to me. Her efforts at reconciliation always came with conditions or explanations that somehow made me responsible for the conflict, and David began to see through these manipulations in ways he never had before. The slap had been intended as a moment of dominance and control, but instead it had become a moment of revelation and liberation. Margaret had shown everyone who she really was, and I had shown everyone who I really was, and the contrast had been so stark that there was no longer any ambiguity about where the problem lay. I never did hear from Margaret directly after that night, but I heard through David that she continued to maintain that she had been justified in her actions and that I had somehow provoked her. The fact that she couldn't acknowledge the wrongness of hitting someone at a professional event told me everything I needed to know about her character and her ability to take responsibility for her behavior. Looking back on that night, I realized that while being slapped in public was humiliating and painful, it was also the moment when I stopped trying to manage someone else's dysfunction and started protecting my own dignity and my merit. Margaret had given me an unexpected gift by showing her true self so clearly that I no longer had to wonder whether I was imagining her hostility or overreacting to her treatment of me. The promotion party that was supposed to celebrate David's achievement had instead become the night when I learned that sometimes the best response to cruelty is simply to let it reveal itself while maintaining your own integrity and grace. The Monday morning after the party, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation that I couldn't quite name. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I wasn't walking on eggshells around David's family because Margaret had removed any pretense about her feelings toward me. There was something almost liberating about not having to decode her passive-aggressive comments or wonder if I was reading too much into her behavior when she had literally slapped me in front of witnesses. David had already left for work by the time I got downstairs, and I found a note on the kitchen counter telling me that he loved me and that he was going to handle the situation with his mother properly this time. The word properly was underlined twice, and I could see the determination in his handwriting. I made myself coffee and sat at the table thinking about how different this morning felt compared to all the other mornings when I had replayed conversations with Margaret, wondering if I should have responded differently or been more patient. My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister Jenny asking if I was okay because she had seen something on social media about an incident at David's work party. I hadn't even thought about the fact that other people might have posted about what happened, but when I checked my own social media, I found several photos from the evening, including one that clearly showed Margaret walking away from the party with a furious expression while David and I stood talking to Mr. Henderson. The photo had been posted by one of David's colleagues with a caption about what a lovely evening it had been celebrating David's promotion, and while there was no direct mention of the slap, the timing and Margaret's obvious anger in the image made it clear that something significant had occurred. The comments on the post were interesting to read because several people who had been at the party were praising how gracefully I had handled a difficult situation without going into specifics about what that situation had been. I called Jenny back and told her what had happened, and I could hear the shock in her voice when I described Margaret slapping me. Jenny has never liked Margaret because she thinks she treats me like hired help rather than her son's wife, but even she was surprised that things had escalated to physical violence. She asked me if I was planning to press charges, and I told her that I hadn't really considered it because I was more focused on the fact that Margaret had basically destroyed her own credibility in front of the people who mattered most to David's career. Jenny pointed out that what Margaret had done was assault and that just because it happened at a social event didn't make it any less serious. She said that if someone had slapped her at her husband's work party, she would definitely be talking to a lawyer because there needed to be consequences for that kind of behavior. I told her I would think about it, but that my main concern was making sure David understood that this couldn't happen again and that he needed to set clear boundaries with his mother. After I hung up with Jenny, I started thinking about all the times over the past 3 years when Margaret had made comments or taken actions that were designed to undermine me but had been subtle enough that David could dismiss them as misunderstandings or personality clash. There was the time she had given me a cookbook for Christmas with a note about how she hoped I would learn to make David's favorite meals the way she did. There was the time she had rearranged the seating at David's birthday dinner so that I was sitting with the children while she sat next to him. There was the time she had introduced me to her friends as David's little wife, with an emphasis on the word little that made it clear she thought I was insignificant. Each of these incidents had been small enough that complaining about them made me feel petty, but taken together they formed a pattern of deliberate disrespect that was impossible to ignore. The slap had been the culmination of 3 years of Margaret testing boundaries and finding that she could get away with treating me badly as long as she was subtle about it. The difference this time was that her anger had made her sloppy and she had revealed her true nature in front of people who could affect David's career. I spent the morning cleaning the house and thinking about how I wanted to handle the conversation I knew David and I would need to have when he got home from work. I had spent so much time over the years trying to avoid putting him in the middle of conflicts with his mother, but I realized that my attempts to protect him had actually enabled Margaret's behavior by making it easier for him to pretend there wasn't a real problem. Around noon, I got a call from an unknown number, and when I answered it, Margaret's voice was on the other end of the line. She sounded different than she had at the party. Less controlled and more desperate, and she started talking before I could even say hello. She told me that I had embarrassed her in front of important people and that I owed her an apology for my disrespectful behavior. She said that she had raised David to expect a certain standard from the women in his life and that I was falling short of those expectations. I listened to her rant for about 30 seconds before interrupting her to point out that she was the one who had slapped me and that I didn't owe her anything, least of all an apology. I told her that her behavior at the party had been witnessed by David's boss and colleagues, and that she was lucky no one had called the police. I said that if she wanted to repair her relationship with David, she needed to start by acknowledging what she had done wrong instead of trying to blame me for her action. Margaret's voice got higher and more shrill as she insisted that I had provoked her by being rude and that any mother would have reacted the same way if someone had spoken to them the way I had spoken to her. I asked her to be specific about what I had said that justified physical violence, and she couldn't give me a coherent answer, just kept repeating that I had been disrespectful and that she wouldn't tolerate that kind of treatment from someone like me. The phrase "someone like me" hung in the air, and I realized that this was the closest Margaret had ever come to saying out loud what she really thought about me. She saw me as beneath her son and beneath her family, and she resented that David had chosen me over someone she considered more suitable. The slap hadn't been an impulsive reaction to something I had said. It had been the physical manifestation of 3 years of accumulated resentment toward my presence in her son's life. I told Margaret that our conversation was over and that any future communication would need to go through David. She started to protest, but I hung up before she could finish her sentence. I felt my hands shaking slightly as I set the phone down because even though I had stood up to her, I still found her anger intimidating on a visceral level. But I also felt proud of myself for not backing down or trying to smooth things over the way I had done so many times before. About 20 minutes later, David called me from his office, and his voice sounded tight with stress when he asked if his mother had contacted me. I told him about the phone call and he sighed heavily before saying that she had called him too and had demanded that he make me apologize to her. He said that when he refused, she had started crying and accusing him of choosing his wife over his family as if those two things were mutually exclusive. David told me that he had finally said something he had been avoiding for years, which was that I was his family now and that his mother needed to accept that or risk losing her relationship with both of them. He said that Margaret had hung up on him after that, but that he felt relieved to have finally said what he really thought instead of trying to manage everyone's feelings. I could hear something different in his voice, a kind of resolve that hadn't been there before, and I realized that the slap had forced him to confront truths about his mother that he had been avoiding. When David came home that evening, he looked exhausted but also somehow lighter, as if he had been carrying a burden that he had finally set down. He sat down next to me on the couch and took my hands and told me that he was done trying to fix his relationship with his mother at my expense. He said that he had spent the day thinking about all the times she had made subtle digs at me or excluded me from family activities, and he realized that he had been making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. I told David that I appreciated his support, but that I needed him to understand that this wasn't just about setting boundaries with his mother, it was about him learning to recognize manipulative behavior and refusing to enable it. I said that Margaret had been testing both of us for years to see how much she could get away with, and that the slap was just the most obvious example of a pattern that had been going on since we got married. David nodded and said that he could see that now and that he was ashamed of how long it had taken him to protect me from his mother's cruelty. He said that he had been raised to believe that family loyalty meant never criticizing his mother's behavior even when that behavior was harmful to other people he loved. He told me that watching her slap me had been a wake-up call about the difference between loyalty and enablement. We spent the next several hours talking about specific incidents over the past 3 years when Margaret had crossed lines and David had either not noticed or had chosen to minimize the significance of what she was doing. It was painful for both of us to revisit those moments, but I could see David beginning to understand how his attempts to keep the peace had actually made things worse by sending Margaret the message that her treatment of me was acceptable as long as she was subtle about it. The next morning, David called his mother and had what he later described to me as the most difficult conversation of his adult life. He told her that her behavior at the party had been completely unacceptable and that she owed me an apology. When she refused and started making excuses, he told her that until she was willing to acknowledge what she had done wrong and commit to treating me with respect, she would not be welcome in our home. Margaret apparently started crying and accused David of abandoning his family for a woman who wasn't worth the sacrifice. David told me that hearing his mother say that about me had made him angrier than he had ever been in his life, and that he had told her that if she couldn't see my worth, then she was the one with the problem. He said that the conversation had ended with Margaret hanging up on him, but that he felt confident he had made his position clear. Over the next few days, we started to hear from other members of David's family who had apparently been contacted by Margaret with her version of what had happened at the party. Most of them called David directly, but a few reached out to me, and I was surprised by how many of them seemed to already know that Margaret could be difficult even if they had never said anything about it before. David's cousin Sarah called me to say that she had heard about the incident and wanted me to know that she supported us completely. She told me that Margaret had made inappropriate comments about me at family gatherings when David wasn't around and that she had always felt uncomfortable about it but hadn't known how to address it. Sarah said that she was glad someone had finally stood up to Margaret because her behavior had been getting worse over the years and other family members had been too intimidated to call her out on it. The conversation with Sarah was eye-opening because it revealed that Margaret's treatment of me hadn't been as subtle as I had thought and that other people in David's family had noticed her hostility even if they hadn't intervened. Sarah told me that Margaret had a history of being possessive of the men in the family and that she had made life difficult for several other daughters-in-law over the years, though never to the extent that she had with me. I asked Sarah why no one had ever said anything to David about his mother's behavior, and she admitted that the family had a pattern of avoiding confrontation with Margaret because she tended to retaliate against anyone who challenged her. She said that most people found it easier to just stay out of her way rather than risk becoming targets themselves. I could understand that logic, but it also made me realize that David and I had been dealing with this problem alone when we could have had allies if people had been willing to speak up. David's father, Robert, called him a few days later, and that conversation was even more revealing than the one with Sarah. Robert told David that he had witnessed Margaret's behavior at the party and that he was appalled by what she had done. He said that he had tried to talk to her about it, but that she was refusing to acknowledge that she had done anything wrong and was instead focusing on what she saw as my disrespectful behavior toward her. Robert apologized to David for not intervening earlier when he had seen Margaret treating me poorly at family events. He said that he had always known his wife could be difficult, but that he had underestimated how cruel she could be when she felt threatened. He told David that the slap had opened his eyes to the fact that Margaret's behavior toward me wasn't just rude. It was abusive, and that he couldn't continue to enable it by staying silent. The most surprising part of the conversation with Robert was when he told David that he was considering separating from Margaret if she didn't get help for what he called her anger and control issue. He said that watching her hit me had made him realize that he had been making excuses for her behavior for decades and that he was tired of being married to someone who could be so cruel to people who didn't deserve it. David was shaken by his father's words because he had never heard Robert criticize Margaret before and certainly had never heard him suggest that their marriage was in trouble. It made David realize that the impact of Margaret's behavior extended far beyond our relationship and that other people in the family had been affected by her need to control and dominate the people around her. As word of what had happened continued to spread through David's family and his professional circle, I began to notice a shift in how people treated me. Colleagues of David's, who had previously been polite but distant, started going out of their way to include me in conversations and social events. It was as if seeing me handle Margaret's attack with dignity had given them a new understanding of my character and my place in David's life. Mr. Henderson's wife, Patricia, called me personally to invite me to a book club that met monthly with several other wives from the company. She told me that she had been impressed by how I had conducted myself at the party, and that she thought I would fit in well with their group. The invitation felt significant because it represented exactly the kind of professional social integration that Margaret had been trying to prevent. I also received an unexpected call from David's Aunt Louise, who was Margaret's sister and someone I had always found intimidating, because she seemed to share Margaret's sense of superiority about family background and social status. Louise told me that she had heard about what happened at the party and that she wanted me to know that she didn't support her sister's behavior. Louise said that Margaret had always been jealous of other women and possessive of the men in the family, but that hitting me had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She told me that she had spoken to Margaret and tried to convince her to apologize, but that Margaret was refusing to admit she had done anything wrong. Louise said that if Margaret continued on this path, she was going to isolate herself from the entire family because no one wanted to be associated with that kind of behavior. The conversation with Louise was particularly meaningful because it came from someone within Margaret's own social circle, and it made me realize that the slap had damaged Margaret's reputation in ways she probably hadn't anticipated. These were people who shared her values about propriety and social behavior, and even they were horrified by what she had done. David started getting feedback at work that was entirely positive about how he had handled the situation with his mother. Miss Henderson told him that the way he had supported me and refused to make excuses for Margaret's behavior had actually enhanced his standing at the company. Several colleagues mentioned that they respected how he had managed a difficult family situation without letting it affect his professionalism. The irony was becoming clear that Margaret's attempt to damage my reputation, and by extension David's career, had actually strengthened both people who witnessed the incident had seen her lose control and behave violently while they had seen me maintain my composure and dignity. They had seen David choose his wife over his mother's unreasonable demands, and they respected him for making that choice. About 2 weeks after the party, David received a letter from Margaret that was unlike anything she had ever written before. Instead of her usual controlled and manipulative tone, the letter was rambling and desperate and full of accusations against me, and demands that David choose between his wife and his mother. She wrote that I had stolen her son from her and that I was trying to turn the family against her. The letter was so unhinged and self-pitying that David said reading it made him feel sad for his mother, but also confirmed that he had made the right decision in setting boundaries with her. She was clearly spiraling as she realized that her usual tactics of manipulation and emotional blackmail weren't working, and that people were holding her accountable for her actions, rather than making excuses for her. David showed me the letter and asked what I thought we should do about it. I told him that I thought we should save it as documentation of her state of mind, but that we shouldn't respond to it because engaging with that kind of emotional manipulation would only encourage more of the same behavior. I said that Margaret needed to face the consequences of her actions without being rescued by our attempts to manage her emotions. The letter also made it clear that Margaret had no intention of apologizing or changing her behavior, which meant that the boundaries David had set were going to need to be permanent rather than temporary. This realization was difficult for David because despite everything he still loved his mother, and had hoped that she would eventually come to her senses and make an effort to repair the relationship. I could see David grieving the mother he had thought he had, and coming to terms with the mother he actually had. It's painful to realize that someone you love is capable of cruelty and manipulation, especially when that person raised you and shaped your understanding of family relationships. But I also saw David becoming stronger and more confident as he stopped trying to manage his mother's emotions and started focusing on protecting our marriage. Around this time, I started thinking seriously about Jenny's suggestion that I should consider legal action against Margaret for the assault. I wasn't interested in pursuing criminal charges because I felt like the public humiliation and family consequences were punishment enough, but I was concerned about setting a precedent that physical violence was something I would tolerate. I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in family law and assault cases, and she confirmed that what Margaret had done constituted assault and that I would have grounds for both criminal and civil action if I chose to pursue it. She also told me that documenting the incident properly would be important if Margaret's behavior escalated in the future and I needed to seek a restraining order. The lawyer suggested that I file a police report even if I didn't want to press charges immediately because having an official record of the incident would be valuable if there were future problems. She said that people who resort to violence once often do it again, especially if they face no consequences for their actions. I decided to file the police report and I asked David to come with me to the station to provide his witness account of what had happened. The process was more straightforward than I had expected, and the officer who took our statements said that assault cases involving family members were unfortunately common, and that we were smart to document what had happened. When Margaret found out about the police report from David's father, she called David in a rage and accused me of trying to destroy her reputation and her life. David told her that I had every right to report being assaulted, and that if she was worried about her reputation, she should have thought about that before she hit me. He said that her anger about facing consequences for her actions just proved that she still didn't understand what she had done wrong. The police report seemed to be a wake-up call for some members of David's family who had been trying to stay neutral in the conflict. David's uncle called to say that he supported our decision to document what had happened, and that he thought Margaret needed professional help to deal with her anger issues. He said that the family had been enabling her behavior for too long and that it was time for her to face real consequences. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Margaret was becoming increasingly isolated, as family members distanced themselves from her behavior. David's father, Robert, followed through on his threat to separate from her and moved into a temporary apartment, while he decided whether he wanted to try to save their marriage or file for divorce. Robert told David that living with Margaret had become impossible because she spent all her time obsessing over what she saw as the injustices she had suffered rather than reflecting on her own behavior. He said that she had become so consumed with hatred toward me that she couldn't have normal conversations about anything else, and that he was tired of listening to her rants about how I had ruined her life. The separation between David's parents added another layer of complexity to the situation, because it meant that Margaret was now dealing with multiple consequences for her behavior rather than just the conflict with David and me. She was losing her marriage and her relationships with other family members and her standing in her social circle, and it was becoming clear that the slap had triggered a chain reaction of accountability that she hadn't anticipated. David was torn between relief that other people were finally holding his mother accountable and sadness that his family was falling apart. I tried to remind him that none of this was his fault, and that Margaret had created these problems through her own choices, but I could see him struggling with guilt about the role our marriage had played in exposing his mother's character. I told David that we couldn't be responsible for other people's reactions to Margaret's behavior, and that if his family was falling apart it was because it had been built on a foundation of enabling and avoiding confrontation rather than honest communication and respect. I said that maybe this crisis would force everyone to build healthier relationships based on mutual respect, rather than fear of Margaret's anger. The transformation in David over those weeks was remarkable to watch. He had always been a kind and thoughtful person, but he had also been conflict avoidant, especially when it came to his family. Watching him set clear boundaries with his mother and refuse to back down even when she escalated her emotional manipulation showed me a strength I hadn't known he possessed. We started going to couples counseling during this time, not because our marriage was in trouble but because we wanted to make sure we were handling the situation in a healthy way, and that we were prepared for whatever came next. Our counselor helped us understand the dynamics of family systems, and how people can become trapped in patterns of dysfunction that seem normal until someone breaks the cycle. The counselor also helped David work through his guilt about his mother's behavior and his grief about losing the relationship he had thought he had with her. She explained that children of manipulative parents often struggle with feeling responsible for their parents' emotions, and that learning to set boundaries is a necessary part of developing healthy adult relationships. Through counseling, I also came to understand that my years of trying to manage Margaret's hostility by being extra accommodating had actually enabled her behavior by making it easier for David to avoid confronting the problem. The counselor helped me see that standing up for myself wasn't just about my own dignity, it was about forcing the family system to function in a healthier way. As the 2-month mark after the party approached, I realized that Margaret still had not made any effort to apologize or acknowledge what she had done wrong. If anything, she seemed to be doubling down on her position that she had been justified in her actions, and that everyone else was wrong to criticize her. This made it clear that the boundaries David had set needed to remain in place indefinitely. The lack of any genuine remorse from Margaret also made me realize that the slap hadn't been an aberration or a moment of poor judgment. It had been a true revelation of her character. She was someone who believed that her feelings and her version of events mattered more than other people's rights and dignity, and she was not capable of the kind of self-reflection that would be necessary to change that fundamental attitude. David and I had several conversations about whether we should make one more attempt to reach out to his mother or whether we should accept that the relationship was permanently damaged. We ultimately decided that the ball was in Margaret's court and that any reconciliation would have to begin with her acknowledging what she had done wrong and committing to change her behavior. We also decided that even if Margaret did eventually apologize, our relationship with her would never be the same because we had seen who she really was when she thought she could get away with it. Trust once broken, especially through violence, is very difficult to rebuild, and we weren't willing to put ourselves in a position where we might be vulnerable to that kind of attack again. The incident at the promotion party had started as what seemed like a humiliating defeat, but had transferred into something much more significant. A moment of truth that had revealed character and forced everyone involved to choose what kind of people they wanted to be and what kind of relationships they were willing to accept. 3 months after the incident, Margaret made her first strategic move to regain control of the narrative, and it came in the form of a family gathering she organized without consulting David or me. She sent invitations to David's entire extended family for what she called a reconciliation dinner at her house, with a note explaining that she wanted to heal the family divisions that had been caused by misunderstandings and hurt feelings. The invitation was a masterpiece of manipulation because it framed the conflict as mutual misunderstandings, rather than her assault on me, and it positioned her as the peacemaker trying to bring the family back together. She knew that most family members wanted to avoid ongoing drama and would be tempted to attend in the hope that everyone could just move past what had happened without anyone having to take sides or hold her accountable. David showed me the invitation when it arrived in our mail, and I could see the conflict in his eyes as he read it. Part of him wanted to believe that his mother had genuinely reflected on her behavior and was ready to make amends, but another part of him recognized this as exactly the kind of manipulative tactic our counselor had warned us about. She was trying to force us into a situation where refusing to attend would make us look like the unreasonable ones who were preventing family harmony. I told David that the invitation itself proved that Margaret hadn't changed because a genuine apology would have come privately to us first, not through a public family gathering designed to pressure us into reconciliation. I said that if she was truly sorry for what she had done, she would have reached out directly to acknowledge her behavior and ask what she could do to make amends, rather than organizing an event that put us in the position of having to choose between attending and looking stubborn or staying away and being blamed for family discord. David agreed that the invitation felt like another manipulation, but he was worried about how it would look to the rest of the family if we didn't attend. Several relatives had already called him to say they hoped we would come and that they were glad Margaret was trying to bring everyone back together. I could see that David was feeling the same pressure he had always felt to prioritize family harmony over his own boundaries, and I knew this was going to be a crucial test of whether he could maintain the progress he had made. We talked about it with our counselor, who pointed out that attending the dinner would essentially reward Margaret's manipulative behavior and send the message that she could assault me and then regain control of the situation simply by organizing a family event. She said that people who are genuinely remorseful don't try to manage the reconciliation process. They allow the people they have wronged to set the terms and timeline for any potential relationship repair. Our counselor also helped us understand that this dinner invitation was likely the beginning of a campaign by Margaret to isolate us from the family and paint us as the unreasonable ones who were holding grudges. She predicted that if we didn't attend, Margaret would use our absence as evidence that we were the ones preventing family unity, and that she would gradually turn family members against us by positioning herself as the victim of our vindictiveness. David and I decided that we would not attend the dinner, but that we would be proactive in communicating our reasons to family members rather than letting Margaret control the narrative. David called his relatives to explain that we appreciated their desire to heal family divisions, but that we couldn't participate in an event organized by someone who had never acknowledged wrongdoing or apologized for assaulting. Most of the family members David spoke to were understanding when he explained our position, though some tried to argue that we should attend for the sake of family unity. David's cousin, Sarah, was particularly supportive and told him that she thought Margaret's approach was manipulative and that she wouldn't be attending either. She said that several other family members were uncomfortable with the way Margaret was trying to orchestrate reconciliation without taking responsibility for what she had done. David's father, Robert, was one of the people who called to encourage us to attend the dinner, and that conversation was particularly difficult because Robert was still hoping to save his marriage to Margaret and saw this event as a potential turning point. He told David that Margaret had been seeing a therapist and that she seemed to be making progress in understanding her behavior. He said that maybe this dinner was her way of trying to make amends, even if she wasn't doing it perfectly. David asked his father directly whether Margaret had acknowledged that hitting me was wrong and whether she had expressed any genuine remorse for her action. Robert was quiet for a long moment before admitting that Margaret still maintained that she had been provoked and that while she regretted the escalation, she didn't think she was entirely at fault for what had happened. That admission confirmed everything David and I had suspected about Margaret's motivation for organizing the dinner. She wasn't trying to make genuine amends. She was trying to manipulate the situation so that she could maintain her position, that she had been justified in her actions, while appearing to be the bigger person who was willing to move past the conflict. It was a calculated move, designed to restore her standing in the family without requiring her to actually change or take responsibility. The dinner took place on a Saturday evening, and David and I spent that time having a quiet meal at home while thinking about what was probably happening at his mother's house. We had heard from Sarah that about half the family had attended, which suggested that Margaret's manipulation had been only partially successful, and that some people were refusing to enable her attempt to rewrite history. On Sunday morning, David received several phone calls from relatives who had attended the dinner, and their reports painted a clear picture of what had transpired. According to his uncle James, Margaret had spent most of the evening talking about how hurt she was by our absence and how disappointed she was that we were choosing to hold grudges rather than forgive and move forward. She apparently made no mention of the fact that she had never apologized or that we had never received any acknowledgement of wrongdoing from her. David's cousin, Michael, who had attended the dinner, called to say that he felt uncomfortable with the whole event because it seemed designed to make us look bad rather than to actually address the problems in the family. He said that Margaret had repeatedly referred to the need for family members to be loyal to each other in difficult times and had implied that our absence showed we weren't committed to family unity. The most telling report came from David's Aunt Carol, who said that when someone asked Margaret directly whether she planned to apologize to me, she had become defensive and said that apologies should go both ways and that I owed her respect for being David's mother. Carol said that it became clear during that exchange that Margaret had no intention of acknowledging her own behavior and was still trying to frame the conflict as mutual fault. These reports confirmed that we had made the right decision in not attending because the dinner had been exactly what we expected, a performance designed to make Margaret look reasonable while painting us as the stubborn ones preventing family harmony. The fact that she couldn't even commit to apologizing when directly asked about it showed that her supposed desire for reconciliation was entirely self-serving. In the weeks following the dinner, we started to see the consequences of Margaret's strategy playing out in the family dynamic. Some relatives became more distant from us, apparently influenced by Margaret's narrative that we were being unreasonable and unforgiving. Others became more supportive as they recognized the manipulation in her approach and realized that we were being unfairly characterized as the problem. David's relationship with his father became increasingly strained during this time because Robert was caught between his desire to save his marriage and his recognition that Margaret's behavior had been wrong. He started making comments to David about how marriages require forgiveness and compromise, as if physical assault was something that could be overlooked for the sake of family harmony. The pressure from Robert was particularly painful for David because he had always looked up to his father and valued his opinion. Watching Robert make excuses for Margaret's behavior forced David to confront some uncomfortable truths about his family's dynamics and the way dysfunction had been normalized and enabled for decades. Our counselor helped David understand that his father's position was also a form of manipulation, even if it wasn't intentional. By suggesting that David should forgive his mother's assault on me, Robert was essentially asking David to prioritize his parents' comfort over his wife's safety and dignity. It was another example of the family system expecting the victims of Margaret's behavior to absorb her dysfunction rather than holding her accountable. Around this time, I started noticing that my own confidence and sense of self-worth had grown significantly since the night of the slap. For years I had internalized Margaret's subtle messages that I wasn't good enough for David or sophisticated enough for his family, and I had spent enormous amounts of energy trying to prove my worth to people who had no intention of accepting me. The slap had paradoxically freed me from that burden because it had made Margaret's hostility so obvious and public that I could no longer doubt my own perceptions or blame myself for the conflict. When someone hits you at a professional event in front of witnesses, there's no ambiguity about who has the problem, and that clarity had been incredibly liberating. I also realized that the incident had strengthened my marriage in unexpected ways because it had forced David to choose between enabling his mother's behavior and protecting our relationship. Watching him make that choice consistently and without wavering had deepened my trust in him and my confidence in our partnership. The changes in David were equally dramatic as he learned to recognize manipulation tactics and refused to be drawn into emotional drama that wasn't his responsibility to solve. He started setting boundaries not just with his mother but with other family members who tried to pressure him into reconciling with her, and he became much more confident in trusting his own judgment about people's motivation. 4 months after the slap, Margaret escalated her campaign by reaching out to my family directly, which was a boundary crossing that shocked even me. She called my mother and told her that she was concerned about the state of my marriage and that she thought I was being influenced by bad advice that was causing me to hold unreasonable grudges against David's family. My mother called me immediately after the conversation to tell me what had happened, and I could hear the confusion and concern in her voice. Margaret had been very convincing in presenting herself as a worried mother-in-law who just wanted what was best for everyone, and who was frustrated by what she characterized as my stubborn refusal to forgive and move forward. I had to explain to my mother the full context of what had happened, including details about Margaret's behavior over the years that I had never shared because I hadn't wanted to burden my parents with our family drama. When my mother understood the complete picture, including the fact that Margaret had never apologized or acknowledged wrongdoing, she was appalled that Margaret had tried to manipulate her into pressuring me. My mother told me that Margaret had specifically asked her to talk to me about the importance of forgiveness and family harmony, and had suggested that my unwillingness to reconcile was putting strain on my marriage that could have long-term consequences. The manipulation was so transparent once my mother understood the context that she became angry at being used as a pawn in Margaret's strategy. This boundary crossing was significant because it showed that Margaret was willing to involve people outside the immediate family in her attempts to control the narrative and pressure us into submission. It also showed that she had no respect for our privacy or our right to handle family conflicts without outside interference. David was furious when I told him about Margaret's call to my mother, and he immediately called her to tell her that contacting my family was completely unacceptable and that she needed to stop trying to manipulate people into pressuring us. Margaret apparently became defensive and claimed that she was just trying to help, but David told her that her help wasn't wanted and that any future attempts to involve third parties would result in us pursuing legal action. The threat of legal action seemed to get Margaret's attention in a way that our previous boundaries had not, and she backed off from direct contact for several weeks. However, we soon learned from other family members that she was continuing her campaign behind the scenes by sharing her version of events with anyone who would listen and positioning herself as the victim of our vindictiveness. During this time, David and I made the decision to start being more open about what had actually happened, rather than allowing Margaret to control the narrative through selective disclosure. We had been trying to avoid airing family drama publicly, but we realized that our silence was allowing Margaret to paint us as the unreasonable ones, while she presented herself as the wronged party. David started being more direct with family members about the fact that his mother had assaulted me and had never apologized or acknowledged wrongdoing. He stopped trying to minimize the incident or frame it as a mutual conflict, and instead started clearly stating that his mother had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed without genuine accountability. I also started being more open with friends and colleagues about what had happened rather than trying to protect Margaret's reputation. When people asked about family tensions or noticed that Margaret wasn't included in our social media posts or family events, I started giving honest answers about the fact that she had assaulted me and that we had cut contact until she was willing to take responsibility for her action. The shift toward transparency had immediate effects as people who had only heard Margaret's version of events learned the full context and realized how they had been manipulated. Several family members apologized to David for pressuring him to reconcile without understanding the true nature of the conflict. David's cousin Peter called to say that Margaret had told him I was holding a grudge over a minor disagreement and that David was being controlled by his wife rather than thinking for himself. When Peter learned that the minor disagreement had actually been Margaret slapping me at a professional event, he was shocked and angry that he had been lied to. The pattern repeated itself with multiple family members and friends who had been given incomplete or false information by Margaret. As the truth spread, her credibility within the family began to erode, and people started to recognize her behavior as manipulative rather than sympathetic. Margaret's response to losing control of the narrative was to become more desperate and erratic in her attempts to regain influence. She started making increasingly dramatic claims about being the victim of a conspiracy to turn the family against her, and she began accusing various people of betraying her by not supporting her version of events. David's father, Robert, called to say that Margaret's behavior at home had become increasingly unstable as she obsessed over what she saw as the injustices being done to her. He said that she spent hours each day crafting emails and letters to family members explaining her position and demanding that they choose sides in the conflict. The escalation in Margaret's behavior confirmed what our counselor had predicted, that people with narcissistic tendencies often become more manipulative and desperate when their usual tactics stop working. Rather than engaging in self-reflection or accepting responsibility, they tend to double down on their victimhood and increase their efforts to control others. This phase of the conflict fact was exhausting because it felt like we were constantly having to defend ourselves against new manipulations and false narratives. Every time we thought we had established clear boundaries, Margaret would find a new way to try to force us back into contact or to damage our relationships with other people. David and I had to develop strategies for dealing with the ongoing manipulation, including documenting all contact attempts and maintaining consistent messaging about our boundaries. We also had to learn to disengage emotionally from Margaret's drama and focus on protecting our own well-being rather than trying to manage other people's perception. The support of our counselor was crucial during this time because she helped us understand that what we were experiencing was a predictable pattern when someone challenges a family system built on enabling dysfunction. She explained that the temporary increase in chaos and manipulation was actually a sign that our boundaries were working and that the system was being forced to change. 6 months after the initial incident, we reached what felt like a turning point when Margaret made a mistake that finally revealed her true character to everyone in the family. She had been working to convince David's father to pressure him into reconciliation by claiming that the separation was causing her serious health problems and that the stress might kill her. Robert had been feeling guilty about the separation and was considering moving back home when he discovered that Margaret had been lying about her health problem. He found out that she had been telling different family members different stories about supposed medical issues and that none of them were true. The discovery that she was willing to fake illness to manipulate people was the final straw for Robert, and he filed for divorce. The divorce filing sent shockwaves through the family because Robert had always been seen as completely devoted to Margaret, and his decision to leave her after 35 years of marriage forced everyone to confront the reality of how serious her behavior problems were. People who had been making excuses for Margaret or trying to stay neutral suddenly had to face the fact that even her own husband couldn't tolerate living with her anymore. David was devastated by his parents' divorce but also relieved that his father had finally recognized the extent of Margaret's manipulation. Robert apologized to David for pressuring him to reconcile with his mother and admitted that he had been enabling her behavior for decades because it was easier than confronting her. The divorce proceedings revealed even more disturbing information about Margaret's behavior as Robert's lawyer uncovered evidence of financial manipulation and emotional abuse that had been hidden from the family for years. It became clear that the assault on me had been just the most visible example of a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior that had affected multiple people. As the truth about Margaret's character became undeniable, even her most loyal supporters in the family began to distance themselves from her. The woman who had once been the matriarch of the family found herself increasingly isolated, as people realized that maintaining relationships with her came at too high a cost. The vindication felt good, but it also came with a sense of sadness about the damage that had been done to the family over the years. How many holidays had been tense because of Margaret's need to control everything? How many relationships had been damaged by her manipulation? How many people had walked on eggshells to avoid triggering her anger? David and I realized that we had been fortunate to escape from Margaret's influence when we did, and that standing up to her had probably saved our marriage from the kind of slow erosion that had affected other relationships in the family. By refusing to enable her behavior, we had protected ourselves and inadvertently helped other people recognize their own need to set boundaries. The legal documentation we had created by filing the police report also proved to be valuable during Robert's divorce proceedings, as it provided evidence of Margaret's violent tendencies that supported his claims about her abusive behavior. Our decision to take her assault seriously had created a paper trail that helped protect other people who were trying to escape her influence. As we approached the 1-year anniversary of the slap, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed and how much we had learned about family dynamics and personal boundaries. The incident that had started as a humiliating attack had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes that extended far beyond our own relationship. Margaret's attempt to put me in my place had instead revealed her own character so clearly that she had lost credibility with everyone who mattered. Her effort to damage my reputation had backfired so completely that I was now more respected and integrated into David's professional and social circles than I had ever been before. The slap had been intended as an assertion of power and control, but it had actually triggered Margaret's complete loss of influence over her family and her eventual isolation from everyone she had tried to dominate. Sometimes the most destructive thing you can do to a manipulative person is simply refuse to be manipulated and let their behavior speak for itself. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, and when Margaret walked in with her lawyer, I barely recognized the woman who had once commanded every family gathering with her imperious presence. She looked diminished somehow, as if the months of isolation and legal battles had worn away the confidence that had always been her armor. Her hair was perfectly styled and her clothes were expensive as always, but there was something brittle about her appearance that suggested she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. David and I were there to provide testimony in his father's divorce proceedings, and the moment felt surreal because we were about to publicly discuss family secrets that had been hidden for decades. Robert's lawyer had explained that our witness statements about Margaret's behavior would be crucial in establishing the pattern of abuse that justified Robert's claims and his request for a significant portion of the marital assets. Margaret's lawyer had tried to block our testimony by arguing that the incident at the promotion party was irrelevant to the divorce proceedings, but the judge had ruled that evidence of violent behavior was admissible in determining the character and credibility of both parties. The legal validation that Margaret's assault on me was significant enough to influence a court decision felt like another confirmation that we had been right to take her behavior seriously. When I was called to the witness stand, I could feel Margaret's eyes boring into me with the same intensity she had shown at the party, but this time I wasn't intimidated by her glare. I had spent months learning to recognize her manipulation tactics and building confidence in my own perceptions, and I knew that her anger was just another attempt to control a situation that was no longer under her influence. The lawyer asked me to describe what had happened at David's promotion party, and I told the story clearly and without emotion, focusing on the specific actions and words rather than my feelings about them. I explained how Margaret had made disparaging comments about my background and my place in David's life, and how she had escalated to physical violence when I refused to accept her characterization of our relationship. Margaret's lawyer tried to discredit my testimony by suggesting that I had provoked the assault through disrespectful behavior, but I was prepared for that attack because our counselor had warned us that abusers often try to blame their victims for triggering their violence. I calmly explained that nothing I had said or done could justify being slapped, and that suggesting otherwise was exactly the kind of victim blaming that allowed abusive behavior to continue. When David testified, he spoke about the years of subtle manipulation and emotional abuse he had witnessed but had been trained to minimize or ignore. He described how Margaret had consistently undermined our relationship through passive-aggressive comments and deliberate exclusions, and how she had trained the family to enable her behavior by making conflict avoidance more comfortable than accountability. The most powerful moment in David's testimony came when Margaret's lawyer asked him why he had chosen to support his wife over his mother, and David replied that he hadn't chosen between them. He had chosen between right and wrong. He said that when someone you love is being abused, your obligation is to protect them, not to make excuses for the abuser, even when that abuser is your own mother. Robert's testimony was devastating to Margaret's case because he revealed decades of psychological manipulation and financial control that had never been visible to the family. He described how Margaret had monitored his spending and isolated him from friends who didn't meet her approval, and how she had used emotional blackmail to control his decisions about everything from career moves to social activities. The financial records that Robert's lawyer presented showed that Margaret had been secretly moving money into accounts that only she could access, and had been making major purchases without Robert's knowledge or consent. She had apparently been preparing for the possibility of divorce for years while publicly maintaining the facade of a devoted wife and mother. Margaret's own testimony was a disaster that revealed the full extent of her narcissism and her inability to accept responsibility for her actions. When asked about the assault on me, she claimed that I had been deliberately provocative and that any reasonable person would have reacted the same way. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why hitting someone at a professional event was considered inappropriate. Even more damaging was Margaret's response when asked about her treatment of Robert over the years. She characterized her controlling behavior as being a good wife who managed the household efficiently, and she claimed that Robert was being manipulated by outside influences who wanted to destroy their marriage. Her complete lack of insight into how her behavior affected other people was stark and disturbing to witness. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, and it included language that made it clear he found Margaret's behavior abusive and her testimony lacking in credibility. Robert was awarded the majority of the marital assets, and Margaret was ordered to undergo psychological evaluation and anger management counseling as a condition of maintaining any contact with family members who were minors. Outside the courthouse, Margaret approached David and tried one last time to convince him that he was making a mistake by supporting what she called the conspiracy against her. She told him that family loyalty should have meant more to him than the opinions of strangers, and that she was disappointed in the man he had become since marrying me. David looked at his mother with what I could only describe as pity and told her that she had taught him the importance of loyalty, but that she had failed to understand that loyalty had to be earned through respect and kindness, rather than demanded through manipulation and fear. He said that the man he had become was someone he was proud of, and that he hoped someday she would find the courage to look honestly at her own behavior. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions as she processed David's words, and for a moment I thought she might finally show some recognition of what she had lost. Instead, she turned to me and said that I had destroyed her family and that she would never forgive me for turning her son against her. The accusation was so divorced from reality that I almost felt sorry for her inability to see her own role in the destruction of her relationship. I told Margaret that I hadn't turned anyone against her, that she had accomplished that entirely on her own through her choices and her actions. I said that if she ever wanted to rebuild relationships with her family, she would need to start by taking responsibility for the damage she had caused instead of blaming other people for the consequences of her behavior. As we walked away from the courthouse, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, including relief that the legal proceedings were over, but also sadness about the complete breakdown of David's relationship with his mother. Despite everything she had done, she was still the woman who had raised him, and her absence from our lives represented a permanent. They also reinforced my conviction that our decision to take the assault seriously and pursue legal documentation had been the right choice, even though it had been painful and disruptive. I also started volunteering with a local organization that helped people escape domestic violence, and I found that my experience with Margaret had given me insights that were useful in supporting other victims of family abuse. Many people don't recognize emotional and psychological abuse as serious as physical violence, but I had learned that they often exist on the same continuum, and that early intervention can prevent escalation. The volunteer work also helped me process my own experience by putting it in the context of a larger social problem, rather than seeing it as an isolated family conflict. Understanding that abuse is about power and control rather than anger or mental illness helped me stop taking Margaret's behavior personally and recognize it as a choice she made, rather than something I had caused or deserved. David threw himself into his work during this period, and his career continued to flourish as he gained confidence and leadership skills that had been suppressed by years of managing his mother's emotional demands. Ms. Henderson promoted him again and gave him responsibility for major client relationships that required exactly the kind of diplomatic skills he had developed while navigating family dysfunction. The irony wasn't lost on us that Margaret's attempt to damage David's career by creating drama at his promotion party had actually enhanced his professional reputation by demonstrating his integrity and his ability to handle difficult personal situations without letting them affect his work performance. We also found that our marriage had been strengthened by the crisis because it had forced us to communicate clearly about our values and our boundaries, and to work together as a team against external pressure. Many couples might have been torn apart by the kind of family conflict we had experienced, but for us it had been a test that proved we could trust each other and support each other through difficult circumstances. Our counselor helped us understand that surviving Margaret's assault on our relationship had given us tools and insights that would be valuable throughout our marriage. We had learned to recognize manipulation and to resist pressure to compromise our boundaries for the sake of keeping peace with people who had no respect for our well-being. 2 years after the initial incident at the promotion party, we received word that Margaret had been hospitalized after what was described as a mental health crisis. David's father called to let us know what had happened and to ask if David wanted to visit her in the hospital. The decision about whether to visit Margaret was agonizing for David, because despite everything she had done, she was still his mother, and the idea of her being alone and suffering was painful for him. At the same time, our counselor warned that people with Margaret's psychological profile often use medical crises as opportunities to regain control over family members who have established boundaries. David ultimately decided not to visit Margaret in the hospital, but he did ask his father to keep him informed about her condition. He said that he wished her no harm and hoped she would get the help she needed, but that he couldn't risk being drawn back into a relationship that had been so destructive to his own mental health and marriage. Margaret's hospitalization lasted several weeks, and according to Robert, she was diagnosed with several personality disorders that explained much of her manipulative and abusive behavior. The medical validation of what we had experienced was gratifying, but it also raised questions about whether Margaret could be held fully responsible for actions that were driven by mental illness. Our counselor helped us understand that having a personality disorder might explain Margaret's behavior, but it didn't excuse it or obligate us to subject ourselves to continued abuse. She said that many people with similar diagnoses learn to manage their symptoms and develop healthier relationship patterns, but that change requires genuine commitment and self-awareness that Margaret had never demonstrated. When Margaret was released from the hospital, she made one final attempt to contact David by sending him a letter that was very different in tone from her previous communication. Instead of making demands or accusations, she wrote about her loneliness and her regret about the damage she had caused to her relationships with family members. The letter included what appeared to be an apology for her behavior, including specific acknowledgement that she had been wrong to hit me, and that her treatment of both of us had been unacceptable. She wrote that she understood why David had needed to establish boundaries and that she didn't expect immediate forgiveness, but hoped that someday they might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship. David showed me the letter and asked what I thought about it, and I could see that he was torn between hope that his mother might finally be capable of change and skepticism based on years of experience with her manipulation. The letter was certainly more self-aware than anything Margaret had written before, but it was also possible that it was just a more sophisticated manipulation tactic. We discussed the letter with our counselor, who pointed out that while it was encouraging that Margaret had acknowledged wrongdoing, words were much easier to change than behavior patterns that had been established over decades. She suggested that if David wanted to consider any kind of contact with his mother, he should wait to see whether Margaret could maintain this new perspective over time without the pressure of wanting something in return. David decided to respond to Margaret's letter with a brief note acknowledging that he had received it and that he appreciated her willingness to take responsibility for her actions. He told her that he needed to see sustained evidence of change in her behavior before he could consider rebuilding their relationship, and that any future contact would have to respect the boundaries he had established. Margaret's response to David's conditional willingness to communicate was revealing, because instead of accepting his terms, she immediately began pushing for more contact and trying to negotiate the boundaries he had set. She wanted to know exactly what she needed to do to earn his forgiveness and how long she would have to wait before they could resume a normal relationship. The pushback against David's boundaries showed that Margaret's apparent insight hadn't really changed her fundamental approach to relationships, which was still based on control and manipulation rather than respect and patience. She was willing to acknowledge wrongdoing if it would get her what she wanted, but she wasn't prepared to genuinely accept the consequences of her actions or to respect other people's need for time and space. David realized that his mother was still trying to manage the reconciliation process rather than allowing him to determine what felt safe and appropriate for him. Her inability to simply accept his terms without negotiation or pressure showed that she hadn't developed the kind of respect for his autonomy that would be necessary for a healthy relationship. We made the decision to return to complete no contact with Margaret because her response to David's letter had demonstrated that she was still fundamentally the same person who believed that relationships should operate according to her preferences rather than mutual respect and consent. The brief hope that she might have genuinely changed had been replaced by the familiar recognition of her manipulative patterns. The final attempt at reconciliation had actually been valuable because it had confirmed that we were making the right choice in maintaining our boundaries. Margaret had been given an opportunity to demonstrate real change, and she had instead revealed that her apparent insight was just another tool in her manipulation toolkit. As we approached the third anniversary of the slap that had started this entire journey, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed and how much we had learned about ourselves and our relationship. What had begun as a humiliating assault had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes that extended far beyond our own marriage. Margaret's attempt to assert dominance over me had backfired so completely that she had lost all influence over her family and had isolated herself from everyone she had tried to control. Her effort to prove that I didn't belong in David's world had instead demonstrated that she was the one who didn't understand how to maintain healthy relationships based on respect and kindness. The journey had been painful and disruptive, but it had also been educational and ultimately liberating. We had learned that it was possible to stand up to abuse even when it came from family members, and that doing so could protect not just ourselves but other people who were also being harmed by the abuser's behavior. Most importantly, we had discovered that our marriage was strong enough to withstand external pressure, and that we could trust each other to prioritize our relationship over the demands of people who didn't respect our boundaries or our well-being. The crisis that could have destroyed us had instead made us stronger and more confident in our ability to face whatever challenges the future might bring. 5 years had passed since that night at the Meridian Hotel, and I was sitting in my office at the nonprofit organization I now ran, thinking about how strange it was that the worst moment of my life had led to some of the best years. The organization focused on helping people escape family abuse and domestic violence, and my own experience with Margaret had given me credibility and insights that helped me connect with clients who were struggling to recognize and address toxic family dynamics. David walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee and the morning newspaper with a smile that still made my heart skip a beat after all these years together. He had been promoted again just last month to Vice President of Client Relations at Blackstone Associates, and Henderson had specifically mentioned that David's maturity and integrity in handling personal challenges had been factors in his advancement. We had developed a morning routine of meeting at my office before work to plan our day and catch up on any family news, and this particular morning David had something important to share. He had received a call from his father Robert, who had remarried a lovely woman named Susan, and seemed genuinely happy for the first time in decades. Robert had called to tell David that Margaret had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at the age of 68. She had been living alone in a small apartment across town, having burned through most of her divorce settlement on legal fees and failed attempts to manipulate various family members back into relationships with her. Robert said that she had died as she had lived in recent years, isolated and angry and blaming everyone else for her circumstances. David's reaction to the news of his mother's death was complex, and I could see him processing a mixture of grief, sadness, and relief that the long, painful chapter of their relationship was finally closed. He told me that he felt sorry for the woman his mother could have been if she had been willing to change, but that he didn't regret the boundaries we had maintained, even though they meant he never saw her again. We had learned through Robert and other family members that Margaret had spent her final years cycling through the same patterns of manipulation and control that had defined her relationships throughout her life. She had alienated several landlords and neighbors with her demanding behavior and had been estranged from virtually every family member by the time of her death. The funeral was small and awkward, with only a handful of people in attendance, including Robert and Susan, David and me, and a few distant relatives who felt obligated to pay their respect. Margaret's sister Louise had driven in from another state, but even she seemed relieved that the ordeal of trying to maintain a relationship with Margaret was finally over. During the service, I found myself thinking about the woman Margaret might have been if she had been capable of self-reflection and genuine change. There had been moments over the years when I glimpsed vulnerability beneath her armor of superiority and control, but she had never been able to sustain the kind of honest self-examination that real growth required. David gave a brief eulogy that was gracious but honest, acknowledging that his mother had been a complicated person who had struggled with relationships, but who had also given him some positive qualities, including his work ethic and his appreciation for education. He didn't pretend that their relationship had been healthy or that her death was an unqualified tragedy, but he also didn't use the occasion to air grievances or settle scores. After the service, several family members approached us to express their gratitude for our role in finally holding Margaret accountable for her behavior. David's cousin Michael said that watching us stand up to Margaret had given him the courage to set boundaries with his own difficult relatives and that the family dynamics had been much healthier since people stopped enabling abusive behavior. Sarah hugged me and told me that she had always admired how I had handled Margaret's attacks with grace and dignity and that my example had inspired her to be more assertive in her own relationship. She said that the slap at the promotion party had been a wake-up call for the entire family about the difference between keeping peace and enabling abuse. In the months following Margaret's death, we noticed that family gatherings became more relaxed and enjoyable without the underlying tension that had always existed when everyone was walking on eggshells to avoid triggering her anger. People felt free to express their opinions and make plans without worrying about whether Margaret would approve or try to sabotage their effort. David's relationship with his father deepened significantly during this time as Robert shared stories about the early years of his marriage, when Margaret had been less controlling and more capable of happiness. Robert admitted that he had often wondered what might have happened if he had set firmer boundaries earlier instead of enabling Margaret's behavior for so many years. The conversations with Robert helped David understand that his mother's abusive behavior hadn't been inevitable and that there had been choice points along the way where different decisions might have led to different outcomes. It was both sad and liberating to realize that Margaret's isolation and misery in her final years had been largely self-imposed rather than the result of other people being unfair to her. My work at the nonprofit continued to grow and expand as word spread about our success in helping people recognize and escape toxic family relationships. I had written several articles about the experience with Margaret, and they had been published in magazines and websites that focused on family dynamics and domestic violence prevention. The articles had resonated with thousands of readers who shared their own stories of dealing with manipulative and abusive family members, and I was amazed by how common these experiences were and how isolated people felt when they were going through them. Many readers said that seeing their experiences reflected in my writing had helped them understand that they weren't crazy or oversensitive and that their reactions to family abuse were normal and justified. David and I had also started speaking at conferences and workshops for mental health professionals about the dynamics of family abuse and the importance of taking emotional and psychological violence as seriously as physical assault. Our story had become a case study in how to effectively set boundaries with toxic family members and how to build support systems that could withstand manipulation and pressure. One of the most rewarding aspects of our advocacy work was hearing from people who had used our strategies to protect themselves and their children from abusive relatives. A woman in Texas wrote to tell us that our article about recognizing manipulation tactics had helped her identify her mother-in-law's behavior as abusive and had given her the courage to insist that her husband set boundaries that protected their marriage. A man in California said that reading about David's journey had inspired him to stop making excuses for his father's emotional abuse and to seek therapy to address the impact of growing up in a household where manipulation and control were normalized. He said that understanding that love shouldn't require sacrificing your dignity or safety had been life-changing for him. The feedback from readers and conference attendees reinforced our conviction that sharing our story had been the right decision, even though it had meant giving up privacy about painful family experience. We had learned that silence often protects abusers more than victims, and that speaking openly about toxic family dynamics could help other people recognize and address similar problems in their own lives. David and I had also used our experience as a foundation for building an even stronger marriage based on clear communication, mutual respect, and unwavering support for each other's well-being. We had learned to recognize manipulation tactics not just from Margaret but from other people in our lives, and we had developed confidence in our ability to set and maintain healthy boundaries. The crisis with Margaret had taught us that love without respect is not really love, and that family relationships should be held to the same standards of basic human decency as any other relationship. We had stopped making excuses for people who treated us poorly just because they were related to us, and we had discovered that this approach led to much healthier and more satisfying connections with the family members who were capable of mutual respect. Our marriage had also benefited from the shared experience of surviving a serious challenge together and emerging stronger on the other side. We had seen each other at our most vulnerable and most determined, and we had learned that we could trust each other to prioritize our relationship over external pressures, even when those pressures came from family members. The promotion party that had started as a celebration of David's career success had ultimately become the beginning of a much larger transformation in our understanding of ourselves and our relationship. What had seemed like a devastating public humiliation had actually been the moment when we stopped accepting unacceptable behavior and started building the kind of life we really wanted. 3 years after Margaret's death, David and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Emma, who would grow up in a family environment free from the manipulation and dysfunction that had characterized David's childhood. We were both committed to raising her with clear boundaries and consistent love, and to teaching her that she deserved to be treated with respect and kindness in all her relationships. Holding Emma for the first time, I thought about how different her life would be from David's childhood, and how the decision to stand up to Margaret had protected not just our marriage but future generations of our family from the cycle of abuse and enabling that had been passed down for decades. David looked at our daughter with wonder and told me that he was grateful every day that we had found the courage to break free from his mother's influence before Emma was born. He said that he couldn't imagine trying to protect a child from Margaret's manipulation and control, and that our decision to maintain no contact had been one of the most important choices we had ever made. The nursery walls were decorated with photos of the family members who would be positive influences in Emma's life, including Robert and Susan and David's cousins and my own parents, who had been nothing but supportive throughout our ordeal with Margaret. These were people who understood that loving a child meant respecting their parents and supporting their family rather than trying to undermine or control them. As Emma grew older, we would tell her age-appropriate stories about the importance of standing up to people who tried to manipulate others, and we would teach her to recognize the difference between people who genuinely cared about her well-being and people who might try to use her for their own purposes. The organization I ran had grown to include programs specifically designed to help parents protect their children from toxic grandparents and other abusive family members, and Emma would grow up understanding that family relationships should be sources of love and support rather than stress and fear. On Emma's first birthday, we hosted a party at our home with all the people who had supported us through the difficult years and who had earned the right to be part of our daughter's life. The contrast between this celebration and the promotion party where everything had started was striking, because this gathering was filled with people who genuinely cared about each other and who had proven their commitment through their actions rather than their words. Mr. Henderson and his wife Patricia were there, along with David's colleagues who had witnessed Margaret's behavior at the original party and who had supported us throughout the aftermath. Sarah and Michael and other family members who had found the courage to speak truth about Margaret's abuse were there, celebrating not just Emma's birthday but the healthier family dynamics that had emerged from the crisis. Robert and Susan brought thoughtful gifts and spent the afternoon playing with Emma and marveling at how peaceful family gatherings could be when they weren't dominated by someone's need to control every interaction. Robert told David that watching him become a father had made him proud of the man his son had become, despite rather than because of his upbringing. As the party wound down and our friends and family headed home, David and I sat on our back porch watching Emma play in her new toys and reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment of contentment and security. The slap that had seemed like such a catastrophe at the time had ultimately been the catalyst for every positive change in our lives. We had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your family is to refuse to enable toxic behavior, even when that behavior comes from people you're supposed to love unconditionally. We had discovered that real strength comes not from enduring abuse, but from having the courage to say that abuse is unacceptable regardless of its source. The woman who had tried to prove that I didn't belong in David's world had ultimately proven that she was the one who didn't understand what family should really mean. Margaret had spent her final years isolated and bitter, while we had built a life filled with genuine love and mutual respect and surrounded by people who celebrated our happiness rather than trying to undermine. David reached for my hand as we watched Emma toddle around the yard and told me that he had never imagined he could be this happy or this confident in his relationships with other people. He He said that learning to set boundaries with his mother had taught him skills that made every other relationship in his life better and more authentic. I squeezed his hand and told him that I was grateful every day for his courage in choosing our marriage over his mother's demands and for his commitment to building the kind of family we both deserve. The slap that was meant to put me in my place had instead put both of us exactly where we belonged, surrounded by love and respect and free from the fear that someone would try to tear down what we had built together. Looking back on those 5 years, I could see clearly that Margaret's assault had been the best thing that ever happened to our marriage. Not because violence should ever be tolerated or minimized, but because it had forced us to confront truths we might have otherwise avoided and to make choices we might have otherwise postponed. The incident had stripped away all pretense and revealed everyone's true character, including our own, and that clarity had been the foundation for everything good that had followed. Sometimes the most destructive people in our lives give us the greatest gifts by making it impossible to continue living in denial about who they really are and what we really deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.